Y'all hear me? A little bit. It's a little low. Something's going on. Oh, wait, I know what. Somebody messed with the switch. I didn't have this last. I know it. I learned it from my leaders. Anyway. Yeah, this morning that computer, the PowerPoint computer, was acting up all funny. So I was thinking something's going on with all this, whatever. Anyway, if you didn't get a chance to go outside today, I feel sorry for you. Oh, wasn't that nice? Why can't it be like that the whole year, right? I'm sure there's reasons, and it doesn't matter. But it was certain. They what? Your mud's almost dry. Don't worry. Give it a day or two, and it'll get right back to where it was.
You know, at the end of summer, when it starts cooling off, you always have the same thing.
That's right. You're very observant. Thanks, brother. I'm glad y'all know me that well. I guess. All right. I'll quit talking about the weather now. Let's get to it. Let's go to the second chapter of 1 Thessalonians. Second chapter of 1 Thessalonians. And as you're doing that, I'm going to ask you a question. What were some things, if you can remember or recall, that the church in this area were commended for? They were, okay, yeah. Their faith was so strong and going so well that it spread. The around areas, the other areas around this church was following that example. In fact, Paul, that's, as far as I know, this is the only congregation where Paul says you are an example to follow. And so, yeah, so you got that. What else were they commended for? Which I guess would be under this umbrella of them being an example. Somebody said something. Teaching, yes, absolutely. They were teaching, so Paul didn't have to. And well, what I'm looking for is, I probably wasn't asking it right, but they were commended for how they received Paul, Barnabas, and Timothy, right? Or Silas. Paul, Silas, and Timothy. And how they received them, and which was a big deal because in this area you have pagan worship, this Gentile area. And so they received them regardless of all the persecution that was happening to them. Paul had even brought that to their remembrance. This is what I've been going through. And we went back over to where he had taken that abuse in Philippi, where he was preaching and then he was beaten and thrown into the inner prisons. And they didn't know that they were Roman citizens. So you have that, which another Christian came about from that account. So yes, they were commended for how they received. And so he brings them to their memory. If you look at verse 3, if you notice and remember from what we talked about last time, he says this: for our exhortation was not of deceit, nor of uncleanness, nor in guile, but as we were allowed, this is where we're going to start our lesson tonight, as we are allowed, of God to be put in trust with the gospel, even so we speak, not as pleasing men, but God, which tries our hearts. For neither at any time used we flattering words, as you know, nor a cloak of covetousness. God is witness. Nor of men sought we glory, neither of you, nor yet of others, when we might have been burdensome as the apostles of Christ. We'll stop there and look right back to verse 4. I have both King James and English Standard in front of me, so I'll probably go back and forth just for clarity's sake. But I want you to notice some things here in verse 4. He says, but as we were allowed of God, right there. This is where we need to be. English Standard says, but just as we have been approved by God. God allows those he approves, and we are approved when we are obedient. And if we are obedient, we have the privilege, we have the allowance, if you will, to do his will. That's a blessing, not a curse, not a begrudging thing. It is something that we get to do. You ever hear the phrase where somebody says, well, I have to do this, or I got to do that. I got to go to church. I got to preach. We ought to be saying what? We get to. We get to. We are allowed to do these things. That word allowed means to be put to the test, approved by examination or by test. Let's look at some verses. Someone please get Romans 12 and verse 2. Someone else please 2 Corinthians 8 and 8. And then chapter 13 and 5. And then I'll give you some more after that. Let's go to Romans 12, verse 2. And this is what I preached on Sunday night.
And be not conformed to this world, but ye be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that ye may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God.
Yeah, I like what the English says. The English Standard says here. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Notice that by testing, you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. You test what is good, what is evil. And how do we do that? Well, we renew our minds. How? That's right. Simple as that. Reading our Bibles. Okay? So that we can discern or judge yes or no, or good or evil, what we ought to do, what we ought not to do. It's by testing here. Same kind of word here. It's being approved. Who's got 2 Corinthians 8 and 8? Yeah, to test your sincerity. To test your sincerity. Okay? And if you go to 13 and 5, what does he say?
Examine yourselves whether you be in the faith. Prove your own selves. Know you not your own selves, how that Jesus Christ is in you, except ye be reprobates.
Reprobates, right? Listen to the English Standard. Examine yourselves to see whether you are in the faith. Test yourselves. Or do you not realize this about yourselves, that Jesus Christ is in you, unless indeed you fail to meet the test? Is there a test? How do you know you have faith? We could say it all day long, right? Yes, I have faith. Yes, I believe. Yes, I obeyed. But then there's some other things that we need to keep up to maintain that faith. Like when trials and persecution comes in your life. How do you respond to that? Faithfully? Or do we go with our own impulses? The natural tendencies. We only know that we have faith when it's been tested. Our faith can only grow when it's been tested. Just like building muscle. You have to put some resistance on them dumbbells so that your muscles can grow, right? Same way with faith. All right, 2 more verses here. 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 10. And then 1 John chapter 4, verse 1. 1 Timothy 3 and verse 10. And then someone else, 1 John chapter 4, verse 1.
And let these also be proved, then let them use the office of a deacon, being found blameless.
Deacons are to be tested. It's not, I don't want to come across to where, like, before you become a deacon at this congregation, you have to sit down and take a Bible test or one of those tests where this is what happened. Write me a paragraph how you would handle it. Well, your life will tell us that, right? You don't have to write anything down. But yeah, to test yourselves. Look, and let them also be tested first. Then let them serve as deacons if they prove themselves blameless. Okay. Last verse, 1 John 4 and 1.
Beloved, do not believe every spirit. Test the spirits, whether they are of God, because many false prophets have gone out into the world.
There it is. Test all people, because there are false prophets out there in the world trying to be cunning, try to pull us away. Just like what Paul is saying here, if you go back to 1 Thessalonians 2, verse 4, but as we were allowed, as we have been approved, as we have passed the test by God. Okay, it's as if some were accusing him maybe perhaps that he was not being tested, or no one tested him to see if he was true, or that they're accusing them of being false. Yes, sir.
There's something in 4 and 6, they're both, they weren't doing it. It's real popular right now. They weren't seeking to please men, and they were seeking men's glory.
That's exactly right.
Both of those things now.
Both of those are synonymous. Those who are seeking the glory. You're getting ahead of me, but that's all right. Seeking the glory. Actually, that's their motive, right? He gets into it here in just a second. So they stand approved to be entrusted or to be put in trust with the gospel. Okay? God has put faith in them to accomplish his work. And God makes no mistakes, does he? That's why we need to look at ourselves and test ourselves and ask the question, are we faithfully going out there with the gospel that we've been entrusted? Because God makes no mistakes. We are obedient to him. He has also entrusted you, and he's entrusted me with the gospel, not to keep it to ourselves, but also spread it, to maintain the faith, to obey the gospel, continue to obey the gospel, but intertwined with that, under this umbrella, that we need to spread the gospel in order to be faithful to the gospel. Y'all confused yet? Like I just confused myself. Someone read 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 16.
But I have used none of these things, neither have I written these things, that it should be so done unto me, for it were better for me to die than that any man should make my glory in Lord.
That's a great verse, brother. Let's go to 1 Corinthians. I love that verse. Yeah, read the next verse,
The next verse, 16. Okay.
please.
For though I preach the gospel, I have nothing to glory of, for necessity is laid upon me. Yea, woe is unto me if I preach not the gospel.
I love that phrase, yea, woe is unto me if what? If I preach not the gospel. Listen to the English Standard. For if I preach the gospel, that gives me no ground for boasting. Why? It hasn't originated from him. It's God's. Okay? If I preach the gospel, that gives me no ground for boasting. I preach the gospel, that which is the power of God to save people. For necessity is laid upon me. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. You see, we've obtained a fortune, and we ought not to keep it to ourselves, right? Spiritually speaking. Yeah, absolutely. Very good point. He's obeying the gospel by spreading the gospel. Okay. Very good. Very good stuff. All right, go back to Thessalonians. All right, so because Paul and the others have been approved and entrusted by God, notice here, they do not seek human glory. So we speak not to please man, but to please God, who, by the way, is the one who tests our hearts. Their goal is not to please men. In fact, if we go to, let's go back to chapter 9 of 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians 9 and 22. I know we were just at 9:16. Paul says, to the weak became I as weak, that I might gain the weak. I made all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. Doing the best he can to fit in with other people so that he could spread the gospel to them. He's not being fake. He's fitting in with other people so that he could win those people and gain their trust. Remember, that's how we do that. That's one of the things we need to do before we can even spread the gospel in some cases. We have to open that barrier. We have to gain trust and confidence in order to do that. So he's not a fence sitter, right? He looked for every way to fit in with others so that he could teach others here. But pleasing men was not his goal. It was to win their trust, okay? If they didn't obey the gospel, that's still on them, right? The blood is off his hands. All right, so he does not seek to please men, which, by the way, further defines or shows his approval or allowance of God and why he's entrusted the gospel, because he doesn't. His goal is what? Not to please men, but what? Please God. Okay, that is his goal. That's the third part of that verse 4. But to please God who tests our hearts. We are responsible to God first, always. Okay, let's go to 1 Corinthians chapter 4. We're going back and forth with 1 Corinthians and 1 Thessalonians. But read with me beginning at verse 1. 1 Corinthians chapter 4, the first 4 verses. This is how one should regard us. Notice, as servants of saints and stewards of the mysteries of God. Moreover, it is required of stewards that they be found, what? Faithful. But with me, it is a very small thing that I should be judged by you or by any human court. In fact, I do not even judge myself. So you have two courts here. For I am not aware of anything against myself, but I am not thereby acquitted. It is the Lord who judges me. So we've got the courthouse of human opinion. We've got the courthouse of the opinion of ourselves, but we also have the courthouse of the main judge. And that's God, which really matters, okay? So we're responsible to God first, not to please people, not to show out, not to make sure. If we have to compromise anything to win, we're not doing anybody any favors. We're not saving souls. In fact, we're pushing people away. All right, so going back to 1 Thessalonians again, my apologies for going back and forth so much. He says, my goal is to please God who trieth or tries our hearts. Pleasing God involves inward approval, not just what is on the outside. In fact, Jesus had several things about that. Had several things to say about that. That it's not on the outside that matters; it's on the inside, because everything originates from where? Yeah, our hearts, right? Matthew 12, Matthew 15, absolutely. Heart, right here, he says, God who tests our hearts, the whole of our inner being. I said this in the sermon Sunday night, but that's what all three lessons were technically about on Christian Servants Day, was about the inner man, about the heart, about the soul. Very, very interesting study on how that word is used in different ways to define, well, the same thing. For instance, heart can can describe our intellect. Heart can describe our emotion. Heart can describe our will or determination. Heart can describe our conscience. And there's scriptures that follow all of that. For example, let's read Genesis chapter 6, verse 5, where the heart explains or describes our intellect. Genesis 6, verse 5. You may think of Genesis 6 and you begin what account? This is the beginning of, Noah and the flood right here. This is where things are starting to go downhill, right? Or it has been. All right. So if you notice there that every intention, every imagination of the thoughts of his heart, it was what? Evil, always evil, continuingly to be evil, looking for things that are evil. That is the intellect. He knows what's right and wrong, but he still chooses wrong, right? Emotion. Let's go to Matthew 22, verse 37.
Jesus said unto him, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy mind.
Yeah, there's some emotion here. With all of our heart, emotion, all of our soul, all of our mind. Okay, love God. Let's see. That's enough of that. Let's go back to 1 Thessalonians chapter 2. Look at verse 5. For we never came with words, or for neither at any time used we flattering words. For we never came with words of flattery. Flattery words were not used by Paul when he is teaching the gospel, when they came to them. Neither at any time. That's the entire time that they stayed in the area in Thessalonica. Flattery carries the idea of using fair words as a means of gaining one's own end. You ever done well in school and somebody called you a teacher's pet? Some of you shook your head no, so maybe that's a terrible example. I excelled really well in band. I was just one of them band students that just got it and clicked, and I wouldn't even be here if it weren't for that right here in Pulaski. But that's beside the point. But as I was learning and I was advancing much quicker than the other students, they persecuted me for that. They made me feel ashamed because I was trying so hard and doing so well. I tried to quit band because of that. But my mama, God rest her soul, she said, "You're not quitting band." And I even got my schedule changed, thinking that she'd never find out. She knew that there was something that I was good at and I could possibly go to college for, which I did and all that. But they called me teacher's pet, blah, 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 and all that. It made me feel shameful. They wanted to bring me down. That was their game, to bring me down. Flattering words sometimes people to gain positions at work may treat the boss or say some things about, to the boss and try to, like a yes man. You know what I'm talking about? Something like that. There's no sincerity in it. That's what I'm trying to say. No sincerity whatsoever. They're just trying to motivate a person to do the will that they want to do by giving them the words. Paul says, you know this. We never came with words of flattery, as you know. You know that we didn't do this. What we did was absolutely sincere. They also did not conceal or hide their motives. That's the second part of verse 5. As you know, nor with a pretext for greed. King James says, nor a cloak of covetousness. And then he says, God is witness, God knows. We didn't try to hide to gain something. All right, that word cloak, a seemingly good front that conceals the real motive, used of putting forward something that is plausible and that might well be true in itself, but that it is not the real reason for doing whatever is done. Someone read Matthew 23 and verse 14. Jesus can teach this better than I can. Matthew 23, verse 14.
Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make long prayers. Therefore you will receive greater condemnation.
Whoa, boy. He says, for a pretense, you make long prayers. That means you're putting on a front. You're fake. And because you're doing that, you're using God for your covetousness. By the way, you're hiding your real will, what you're wanting to do. You're hiding it with, oh, I'm holy. Right? They're going to receive a greater condemnation. Absolutely. Paul denies that his work among those in Thessalonica, it's not a cover-up. He says, going back, he says this. Cloak of covetousness. That's greed. To have more. You see, that's why they're hiding it, because they want to gain more, right? An eager desire to get more in order to feel self. Paul calls covetousness what in Colossians 3 and verse 5? You can look it up. It's okay. Colossians 3 and verse 5. Covetousness, which is idolatry. It's idolatry. That buzzer seems to always go off at the right time. It's idolatry. Because what happens when people are being covetous. Is that right? When they are coveting, if I can talk right. What they're doing is they are putting everything aside and only desire one thing. And what they're essentially doing is they're making for themselves a little g God. That's what covetousness is. It is idolatry. David Lipscomb said this about it. Those who reject the God of the Bible formulate a God from their own imagination and desires. Such a little g God is of necessity the deification of their own reason, desires, appetites, and lusts. The heathen embody them in idols of wood, stone, and metal, which are visible objects of worship, but These images are all representatives of certain qualities which they cherish and seek to attain. They are the embodiment of their ideas of the highest good. A man really worships that on which his heart is most earnestly set, which is the chief end of his laboring life. That which man most ardently desires, he worships. And the service he renders in obtaining it is worship. Hence, the Holy Spirit defines covetousness to be idolatry. The man that is covetous unduly desires and seeks money, worships it, and becomes sordid, heartless, selfish, and his whole soul is absorbed in the one end of gaining money. When a man desires, above all things, to gratify his lusts and fleshly appetites and finds happiness only in this, he worships the god of lust. Becomes, well, I don't even know how to pronounce that, licentious. Becomes licentious, sensual, loses all ennobling spiritual aspirations, and abandons himself to the gratification of his lust, and the same is true of covetousness. That's why it's idolatry. It's a selfish thing, and he's only doing that to obtain that one thing he desires. That's his God. What do you desire? You desire that promotion? It's okay to want a promotion. I'm not saying that. It's not okay to want that promotion so bad that you're willing to throw everything out to obtain that promotion. Does that make sense? That would include morality. Same thing going on with the country and legislation, right? Morality is out the door so they can obtain their lusts and do what they want to do to satisfy their fleshly hunger. That's idolatry. You see, they say they're atheists, but they're not. They do worship. They just don't realize it. Any questions or comments? I was hoping to cover one more verse, but you know me. Well, all righty then. Lord willing, we'll continue next week.